Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about DevOps and how to measure it. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, this DevOps thing, what is it about and how do you actually measure if it is working? And the short answer is you measure it on key metrics such as time to market, downtime, and bug reports. That's pretty much what you do. Let me explain. So DevOps is a tricky subject. It's a very tricky subject to explain because most of the industry has absolutely no idea what it is. Everybody calls it DevOps. Like it's at this point so fun that some people, honestly, it feels a little bit to me as back in the day when you would listen to beginner front-end developers talk about jQuery as if it was JavaScript. People couldn't make the distinction between jQuery and JavaScript. They had no idea that these were two different things. And DevOps is a very similar thing. I don't know how many people I talk to who think that Kubernetes and Docker, that's the entire thing. That's DevOps. Well, no, it's not. If we're going to try to define this in some meaningful way, I suppose the best way I can define it for you is that the delivery process of code, like there's two perspectives to this. You have the operations perspective and then you have the developer perspective. So in general, a DevOps engineer is an operations person or a person who has an intimate knowledge of infrastructure and the associated tooling and has the ability to write software. But the core idea of DevOps, like the underlying idea, is that the development team should own the entire process. What does that mean? Well, it's very simple. It used to be the case that you had operations people, took the code, like we usually call it, you threw it over the wall to the operations people. The operations people were completely disconnected from the development team, and when they got the code, usually in a tarball or some zip file or a jar or something like that, they would deploy that out into production, and then they were responsible for making sure that, the metrics are correct, the latencies are correct, taking care of the logs if there are any bugs and reporting that to the development team, etc., right? So they were responsible for that. Now, the developers, they didn't really have anything to do with this, and this is the idea of DevOps, because people have started to realize that the more responsibilities that you can give to the development team, or if you can include the actual monitoring and responding to alerts and being on call and like all of that stuff, because the problem is that the operations person, if they find that, there's an issue here, there's not much, well, it depends, right? But oftentimes there's not much they can do about it, because if there's a bug in the code, they need the developers. So the industry kind of came up with this idea that, but now that we have things such as Docker and Kubernetes, Ansible, Puppet, Chef, etc., these tools that make it much smoother and easier to set up environments. Terraform is also a really good one. You could actually offload some of those requirements that used to be on the operations people and the system administrators over to the developers, because now it is easier for fewer people to actually do all of this. And the term DevOps was born from this idea that, you have a person who is actually involved from the coding stage and all the way up until this thing reaches production. They own the whole pipeline. And by owning that whole pipeline, you have the most capable person, or the person with the most intimate knowledge of the entire system or that part of the system, on hand at all time, right? At all stages in time, right? And you can approach this in two different ways. You can be a developer who learns how to use a lot of these infrastructure-related tooling and learns how to work in clouds these days and so forth. Or you can turn it around and you can say that, we have a infrastructure person or some operations person, basically, who starts learning some coding in order to be able to actually produce internal tools, etc. Now, the key thing here is that depending on like how you split the responsibility, depending on if you have how you actually manage the people who are supposed to be DevOps engineers, you may not be pure DevOps, you may not be even DevOps. It's so hard because if you put them in, if you do a simple thing such as, oh, you take these DevOps quote unquote engineers and you put them in a different team and they're managing most of the infrastructure full time, well, then technically you can't say that they're DevOps engineers anymore. Well, they're not doing DevOps because they're not actually involved in the product development stage, or they're not involved in delivering the software that they are managing. They're just taking care of the infrastructure. It's just that now they know how to write code. And I hate to break it to most of you, but just because you were an operations person a few years ago, that doesn't mean that you didn't know anything about coding. You didn't have to, but I'm pretty sure there were quite a lot of people around who knew at least basic Python if you're working in a Linux environment, some basic scripting, things like that. So you were a DevOps engineer before the term was invented. Bully for you. Anywho, so how to measure the value of this? This is the thing that is tricky, because if you are going to measure anything, the only thing that you can possibly do is to you have to invest before you start trying to figure out if you can measure this. And what I mean by that is that unless you have a track record, unless you are already in the business of measuring what you're doing, which honestly, there's quite a lot of people who at a lot of companies who will claim that they are measuring how well they do, when they're actually not. You know how most people measure how well they're doing? The amount of annoyance the developers feel, and especially the business people feel, over bugs. And everything else, as long as it's not critical problems with the network or critical problems with latencies or being unperformant or things of this nature, usually, if they are measuring this at all, the only people who kind of know about it is the operations team, more or less, because that is one of their jobs, right? But that's the first part of it. You need to actually know where you are today in order to measure this, and then you need to start asking the fundamental question before you go over to something like, say, DevOps. You have to ask, what is it that I'm looking to improve? Because I'm very sorry to say that I've been in companies where the only thing they really wanted to gain from DevOps was not to improve the quality of the application. They just wanted to not have to pay the operations people. They just wanted to fork over all the responsibilities on the developers so that they could pay less, but at the same time maintain the same development speed. And that's just not going to happen unless they actually invest in this sort of culture in a way where this is actually feasible, which of course they didn't. They just, money people are not very good engineers, I'm sorry to say. But if you're going to do this, the way to measure DevOps in a way that actually makes sense, if you ask me, is to first and foremost ask the question, how long does it today take a developer to ship a new feature? You have to measure that. How long does it take for you to go from, oh, I have this code in my, it's ready now, I'm going to deploy it, or I'm going to move my code from my laptop into the hands of the users. Measure that time. That is one of the most important measurements, the most important metrics, at least if you ask me, for DevOps. If you can reduce that time down, that means that your time to market has been reduced. There is, I think, no more important metric for DevOps in general. Performance and things of this nature is absolutely something that could be something that, it could be something worthwhile. The thing that I will argue about performance metrics when it comes to DevOps is that there's no real reason that you can't have a traditional operations team and a developer team and still have a performant application. You can do that. There's no reason for you to have quote-unquote DevOps to achieve that goal. It's just, they just have to collaborate, or the code needs to be, like the server needs to be optimized and the code needs to be optimized, and then this should take care of itself, right? But apart from the metric of how fast is your time to market, another metric that is extremely important is how much downtime do you have, or at the very least, how quick is your response time? Like how long does it take you today to go from, and how many people? Like what's the impact of this? So if something goes wrong, how long does it take you to go from discovery to solution? These two things, if you ask me at least, are the most important metrics that you can use in order to measure how successful you are at DevOps. So what I want you to take away from this is that DevOps is a term that more or less means that you have engineers who are involved not only at the development stage, but they also monitor and own the application. Classic saying is, you built it, you run it, or you maintain it, whichever you want to call it, right? So that's the general definition of DevOps, and you can be a DevOps engineer by being an operations person who knows coding, or a coder who knows how to use some of these infrastructure tooling that we have today, and knowing things about infrastructure. And if you're going to measure how successful your company is at this thing, I highly recommend that you look at time to market. How long does it take your developer team to go from development to released into production? That's the thing that you're trying to optimize for. The quicker you can ship things, the better. And the other thing is, how stable does your system actually become? Like how, or at the very least, how fast do you resolve issues from discovery? Like when you find an issue, how long does it take you to get and that ties into that as well, like how fast can you ship something? Because that's the whole heart in DevOps. The whole heart of it is that you're supposed to be able to ship quicker with more confidence. The bonus you gain from it is that usually quite a lot of developers feel they take more responsibility, and that is the psychological effect DevOps has on quite a lot of people. But that's not always a given, but it's a very nice bonus. Have a great day.